Hi everyone and welcome back to Bible Matters. My name is Adam Erickson and today we are going to be talking about Ezekiel. Ezekiel was one of the greatest prophets in all of Jewish tradition, and the book is filled with crazy visions and intense violence, so much so that the ancient rabbis said you should really be about age 30 before you start reading Ezekiel. Now, I'm 37, and this book scares me. The first chapter of Ezekiel starts off with this really crazy vision of a chariot that is carrying around God, and it moves this way and that way, and it's got these four faces of animals and a human, and it's just really wild. And people throughout history have been trying to figure out what exactly Ezekiel sees in this vision, and nobody really knows. And some commentaries that I've read say that's the way it's supposed to be. You're not really supposed to know what this vision of God really is, because there's something mysterious about God that you cannot explain. And so stop trying to explain this vision that Ezekiel has in chapter 1, which is just fine because we can figure out what Ezekiel is trying to get at in other ways. Ezekiel was a prophet during the Babylonian exile. When Babylon came to Jerusalem and destroyed the city, destroyed the temple, and sent many people, including Ezekiel, out into exile. And the great question that this traumatic experience caused people to ask was, where is God in all of this? Why did this happen to us? How did this Babylonian Empire come in and destroy us when God was supposed to be here protecting us? What is justice in all of this? And those are the questions that Ezekiel was trying to answer. And Ezekiel's answer came in the fact that God is just. And the problem that was happening in Jerusalem during this time was a complete failure of political leadership. If anyone tells you that the Bible isn't political or that faith isn't political, you just send them right to Ezekiel. Ezekiel says that the reason that this happened is because the rulers of Jerusalem didn't care for the weak and the poor and the marginalized of the culture. In fact, the rulers oppressed them. Ezekiel has this phrase where he says that the rulers shed the blood of the people. The big problem for Ezekiel in Jerusalem was the shedding of blood, was oppression, was economic inequality. The rulers had all the money and they refused to share it with the poor. You see this especially in chapter 34 of Ezekiel, where Ezekiel talks about the shepherds. And the shepherds was an ancient way of talking about the rulers of a city. God says through the prophet Ezekiel, "Ah, you shepherds of Israel who have been feeding yourselves, should not shepherds feed the sheep? You eat the fat, you clothe yourselves with wool, you slaughter the fatlings, but you do not feed the sheep. You have not strengthened the weak, you have not healed the sick, you have not bound up the injured, you have not brought back the strayed, you have not sought the lost, but with force and harshness you have ruled them." The reason that the nation fell was because the political rulers neglected to care for those who were marginalized in the nation. But the violence of imperial Babylon doesn't have the last word. Ezekiel has this amazing vision where God replaces the heart of stone with a heart of flesh, and people start caring for the needs of one another, especially for the needs of the marginalized. The people had become dead to one another, and Ezekiel has this vision of the dry bones of a place of death where God brings the bones back together and breathes life into these dead bodies, and the people live once again. And this is the vision of a renewed Jerusalem. And the warning here for the renewed Jerusalem is found with the shepherds. The shepherds are to care for the sheep. The political rulers are to care for those who are on the underside of culture so that nobody is on the underside of culture. Now, there are some people who say, oh, the Bible is just an ancient book and we live in the modern world and we're so much better than them back there. They were stupid. They didn't have science or anything to tell us. Why should we take morals from people who lived back in the Bronze Age? Well, here's why this matters. Because in the United States today, we have severe economic inequality. The top 20% of U.S. households holds more than 84% of U.S. wealth. And the bottom 40% of U.S. households has just 0.3% of all the wealth. And the gap just seems to be continuing to grow. Now, many people will say, well, it's just because some people work harder than others. That's the myth of the American dream. The disparity in economic wealth has less to do with how hard you're willing to work and more to do with inheritance, social location, and structural discrimination. And the prophet Ezekiel is there calling to us, saying any nation that continues the oppression of economic violence will not stand. It will fall because God is a God of justice and has set up the world in such a way that justice must prevail for a nation to stand. So that is the prophetic warning for the rulers of Ezekiel's day and for the rulers of ours. Interestingly enough, about 500 years after Ezekiel, Jesus would come along and say to his followers, "Do you love me? Then feed my sheep." Jesus would claim to be the good shepherd, the good king of the world. And what does the good king do? What does the good king do? He serves. He feeds the sheep. Jesus says, I have sheep that are not of this fold. To be a sheep of Jesus is not to be a blind follower. It's to be somebody who is marginalized, on the underside of human culture. Somebody who needs to be fed spiritually, emotionally, physically. And that's what the rulers of the kingdom of God are to do.